Maverick News presents The Rick Walker Show. Defrag your mind.
That's better. I'm back as promised, and we are going to bring you, ladies and gentlemen, here on the Maverick News channel, Maverick family, the full committee hearing of the Privacy and Ethics Committee in Canada, House of Commons in Ottawa, where this committee today was dealing with foreign election meddling in Canada's elections. And the committee in this hearing is going to hear from two former intelligence officials who are calling for a complete transformation of Canada's security apparatus in order to counteract expanding foreign interference operations. These experts say that they have been witnessing an expansion of those kinds of operations since the 1990s, and they say that warnings to all levels of government in Canada have basically been ignored. So tonight, we bring you the full committee hearing so you can get it straight from the source. Stay with me. I'll be right back, and the broadcast will begin. Don't go away.
Greetings, brave Mavericks. Our quest for truth continues. We go beyond fake news. Together we expose propaganda. Together we pull others out of rabbit holes. We are maverick thinkers. We are all unique individuals. Defenders of individual rights and freedoms. Credible. Trusted. Grounded in reality. Maverick News. Maverick News. Defending free speech. Free speech. Donate at freedomreporters.com. Do it now. Tomorrow may be too late. Maverick News. The world is watching.
Format pursuant to the House Order of June 23rd, 2022, and therefore, members can attend in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application.
Should any technical challenges arise, please advise me immediately. Please note that we may need to suspend for a few minutes as we need to ensure all members are able to fully participate. And pursuant to Standing Order 1083H and the motion adopted by the committee on Wednesday, December 7th, 2022, the committee is resuming its study of foreign interference and threats to the integrity of democratic institutions, intellectual property, and the Canadian state. In accordance with the committee's routine motion concerning connection tests for witnesses, I am informing that all witnesses have completed the required connection tests in advance of today's meeting. I'd now like to welcome our witnesses. First, Kenny Chiu, a former member of Parliament. Michel Juneau Katsuya, who is the former chief of the Asia Pacific Unit of Canadian Security Intelligence Service. Jonathan Manthorpe, international affairs columnist and author. Victor L.M. Ho, retired editor of Sing Tao Daily, British Columbia edition. He's with us online. Dan Stanton, who's the former executive manager, Canadian Security Intelligence Service, and Artur Wilczynski, senior fellow, Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, Faculty of Social Sciences for the University of Ottawa. I thank all of you for being with us today. We have 2 hours. We're going to have 30 minutes of opening statements, 5 minutes each. I'm going to keep to the timelines today so that we can get as much in as we can. Mr. Chiu, you have 5 minutes to address the committee. Please commence.
In general, for many years, our national security apparatus has identified foreign interference efforts by the top perpetrator countries as Russia, Iran, and PRC. During my term as an MP, I actively supported and worked with Canadians in the Persian community to tackle foreign interference and coercive transnational repression here. However, I shall share my views and experience using the Chinese Communist Party example as a window into how it is implemented here in our country. The aim of CCP regime shadow operation is to exploit what they see as weakness to advance their interests and influence in our decision-making process, and domestically as well as internationally. Because of language barriers and cultural challenges, we have diaspora communities that feel most comfortable with and even exclusively consume ethnic media contents. Popular CCP-sanctioned monolithic technologies like WeChat also provide a convenient platform to either suppress dissension or promote and spread disinformation. That presents a golden opportunity for the CCP. As filed by Alliance Canada Hong Kong in a 2021 submission and a March 2023 Radio Canada investigative report, the communist regime has successfully monopolized Chinese ethnic media, either through complete takeover or being co-opted via the carrot and stick approach with business interests. With the successful execution of this strategy, CCP has effectively controlled the diaspora community's hearts and minds. In the long run, it perpetrates a false narrative of a complete equivalency of the Chinese Communist Party, China, the state, and Chinese, the race. Therefore, criticizing the CCP will quickly escalate into anti-Chinese racism. Globally, the CCP is also consistently spreading a lie, weaponizing nationalism that, quote, Western world led by the US is selfishly suppressing a rising China, that CCP miraculous achievements. It's the reason why all ethnic Chinese can finally lift their head high, and that there remains much colonial, imperialistic, anti-Asian racism in these hypocritical Western democracies, and only the CCP's interests align with the welfare and betterment of ethnic Chinese worldwide, unquote. This explains why the recent CSIS whistleblower reports by reputable media such as the Globe and Mail, Global News, and the CBC have been portrayed by some pro-CCP mouthpiece media and commentators as Canada's, quote, deliberate racist acts under the U.S. command to undermine a rising China, unquote. The lack of reliable and reputable fact-checking resources in their language further perpetrates the miscommunication. It sends a deep distrust and resentment of Canadian society in general and pits the we versus they divide and conquer struggle among us. With that long-term foundation laid and continue being laid as we speak, the regime can activate their political influence by spreading and seemingly authoritative commentary or news stories at their right time. For example, in 2021, a complete mischaracterization of my proposed establishment of foreign influence registry was circulated in WeChat and WhatsApp groups that it is anti-Chinese or a pretext of a future Chinese internment effort, or that if elected prime minister, the anti-Chinese Aaron O'Toole, then conservative leader, will ban WeChat, jeopardizing the only familial or business link they so rely on. Their goal is twofold: to install a decision makers that they have access to or control of, or to remove those that stand against their efforts, quote unquote, vocal detractors, if you will. To be clear, a beneficiary of these efforts does not necessarily imply collusion. CCP not only honors the age-old philosophy that an enemy's enemy is a friend, they also practice equal opportunity among races, corruption and collusion with anybody willing to submit within or outside of the Chinese community. 2018, Australian Senator Sam Dastyalli resigned in a Chinese government-linked scandal served as a good reminder. Indeed, to link any effort against foreign interference with anti-Asian racism not only plays into the CCP playbook, it is a racist comment in its own, since it implies CCP will only corrupt ethnic Chinese, ignoring all the cries and demands for actions from the very same community, some of whom had taken the great effort in speaking in front of the House committees such as yours. In conclusion, foreign interference and transnational repression are complex geopolitical issues. Unfortunately, in my humble opinion, Canada has run out of time in dithering and procrastinating. This is not the moment for more talks and virtual signaling, but legislative actions that aim to protect Canada, your home, and home to many cultural communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chiu. Next, we're going to go to Mr. Juneau Katsuya. Sir, you have 5 minutes.
Monsieur le Président, merci, chers collègues.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts and analysis based on more than 30 years of work, research, investigation, and analysis of Chinese intelligence activities in Canada. I've done this work as a counterintelligence officer, as a security consultant to the private sector, and an academic.
Claim openly with evidence that CSIS has known about Chinese foreign interference in Canada for at least the last 30 years. Every federal governments, from Mr. Mulroney to Mr. Trudeau today, have been compromised by agents of the Communist China. Every governments were informed at one point or another. Every government chose to ignore CSIS warning. Every government were infiltrated by agent of influence acting on behalf of the Chinese government. Every government took decisions that are questionable about China and can only be explained by interference exercise from within. Every government let their decision process manipulated by two reasons: partisanship and agent of influence succeeding in controlling the message. Every prime ministers and or their staff chose to ignore the seriousness of the threat. Not only the sitting government has been compromised, but all political parties also have been compromised at one point or another. The inaction of the federal governments led to attack on many municipal and provincial governments. Ultimately, every government have been part of the problem, not part of the solution. And a reminder, not only China practice foreign interference. Again, we have evidence, names, circumstances when all this happened. Le principe de l'ingérence.
The principle of interference is to present temptations to those targeted. This is one of the weaknesses of a democratic system. The Chinese agents have understood this well and have proven that they know how to exploit it. It is up to us to finally give ourselves concrete means to strengthen our defenses. In light of these facts, I would like to propose some thoughts. First, it is imperative to give the country a criminal law on foreign interference defining the activities considered illegal and the penalties that can be incurred. Second, I welcome the initiative to create a national office against foreign interference, but to place it under the Minister of Public Security is not appropriate. I've said it before and I will say it again. All past and present governments have been part of the problem, not the solution. All have been warned and ignored. For this new body to report to a minister is to repeat the same pattern of failure and political interference. This office must be independent, separate from CSIS and the RCMP, and it needs to report directly to the House of Commons with a director appointed by the House. This office must have legislative powers to investigate, search, arrest, and prosecute in a criminal court without having to ask anyone's permission, and be able to inform the public without political interference. Furthermore, a budget of $13.5 million over 5 years is not enough. There must be investigators who can cover all regions of Canada, and to do this, having local offices to work not only for the federal government, but also to assist the provinces and municipalities is imperative. I would add that the $48.9 million promised over 3 years to the RCMP to protect communities may have little impact without a national office. Furthermore, the RCMP, like CSIS, cannot be the investigative body since in the current structure, They have not been able to get governments to act in 30 years. So how can we expect this to change tomorrow?
A mandatory process where future election candidates must swear and sign a declaration that they are not under the influence or acting on behalf of a foreign government or entity. This form will clearly warn the possible criminal procedures in case of intentional deception. Similar process must be established for all political staff and volunteers during hiring process. Fourth, eliminate the possibilities for foreigners to vote for the selection of candidates and nominees. This is an obvious nonsense. Fifth, prohibit for a period of 3 to 5 years or all leaving cabinet members and senior public servants from working or participating to any activities or job related to their previous function. En terminant,
In closing, a quick word on the idea of a commission of inquiry. This is not the way to go. A public commission will inevitably reveal the investigative methods of our security services and thus diminish our effectiveness in detecting and neutralizing the threat while putting human sources at risk. Already, with the revelations revealed, we have helped the Chinese services to counter us. It is likely that in the current political climate, attention will be given to the timeline of events seeking to blame the government when its predecessors have all done the same thing. It is time to prioritize national security in a non-partisan manner and protect the future of this nation.
I'm looking forward to answer your question.
Merci, Monsieur Juneau, Katsuya.
Thank you, Mr. Juneau Katsuya.
Mr. Manthorpe, sir, you have 5 minutes to address the committee.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity. I'm also honored to be amongst such a good raft of witnesses for you. And let me just say that I agree with everything that you've heard so far this morning. I think those are both excellent presentations, and I'm sure it will be the same from the other witnesses. I'm going to be very brief and basically just outline what is covered in my 2019 book, Claws of the Panda. Relations at the official level between Canada and the Chinese Communist Party began in China in the 1930s, over 80 years ago. What is remarkable is how little the attitudes towards the relationship and the objectives of both sides have changed over those 8 decades. In their early encounters with Chinese communist cadres, Canadian officials showed a fundamental naivety about the purposes of the party that continues to this day, despite all the evidence that they are delusional. But from the start, the Canadians saw the communists as a reformist rather than a revolutionary party. They nursed then, and many still do, the hope and expectation that the Canadian models of politics, administration, and law would be templates for reform that the Chinese Communist Party would follow. The Huawei affair, which started just as my book Claws of the Panda was being published, should have dispelled that blind optimism. It should have made it clear, beyond doubt, that we have no shared values with the Chinese Communist Party, and that we cannot have a normal relationship with a regime whose first instinct when there is a problem is to take hostages. The Chinese Communist Party's objectives in the relationship have been equally consistent. First was and is to make Canada a supporter of Beijing on the international stage where possible, and to minimize Ottawa's criticism if there is no support. Second was and is to gain access through Canadian universities and research institutes to Canadian and United States technology, especially technology with military uses. Third was and is to get unrestricted access to Canadian agricultural and natural resources. The Chinese Communist Party does not believe in market economics. Fourth was and is to have open access to Canada's market for Chinese manufactured goods. Fifth, and critically important in my view, was and is to be able to control and use Canadians of Chinese heritage, especially those advocating for reform in China. By my count, the Chinese Communist Party has achieved all its objectives in Canada, while we have hardly had a shot on goal. I will end there, and I will be happy to try to answer any questions from committee members. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Manthorpe. Well under time, which I appreciate because it'll give us more time for questions. Mr. Ho, you have 5 minutes, sir, on video to address the committee. Go ahead, please.
Yes. As a retired journalist working for the Chinese Canadian Media Organization for 25 years, I observed that the most efficient way for the CCP to control Chinese language media is to co-opt top management of the targeted company. Then the editorial policy of that medium will always follow the party line in China. Here are several tactics of CCP usually used in local Chinese community. First, one, propaganda. In early days, short propaganda radio programs prepared by the United Front Work Department were broadcasted by Radio AM 1320 in Vancouver. Such efforts has been expanded now to full-page ads in local Chinese papers to demonstrate massive support on PRC draconian policies, to embed pro-PRC media personnel in various Chinese language media to speak well of the PRC narratives, influence Chinese language media CEOs and editors by inviting them to tea at the Chinese consulate compound and by leverage via advertising dollars. 3, arouse a distorted sense of nationalism towards motherland by exploiting selected parts of BC history to reinforce ideas of Western imperialism, colonialism, or racism towards Chinese ethics. 4, identity politics. People of a particular race and culture develop political agendas that are based upon these identities. Identity politics is deeply connected with the idea that some groups in society are oppressed and begins with analysis of that oppression. 5, magnifying the narratives and success of PRC, propagating the CCP mantra that we are into an era of a rising East and declining West. 6, disinformation. Accuse the West of treating assumption as facts, of being jealous of China's success to the point of unfair trade practices, say like Huawei, TikTok, and of stigmatizing the entire Chinese community by the recent suggestion of a foreign influence registry bill, etc. 7, polarize and divide the community by a choice of pro-PRC news commentators who would ridicule, reiterate the failures of the West, and by the reference to the presence of patriots and traitors in the context of Hong Kong. 8, during election, assist by supporting candidates favored by PRC and by not interviewing candidates critical of CCP, say like Kenny Chiu. 9, establish CCP's own Chinese language media in a Canadian soil. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ho. Next, we're going to go to Mr. Stanton. You have 5 minutes, sir, to address the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, members. My insight and understanding of PRC foreign interference comes from 32 years of operations with the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, most of which was in what we called counterintelligence. I worked in CI against hostile states, both in the field and in headquarters for a number of years. And this also includes what we refer to as state-driven foreign interference. When I started working was in the Cold War, and espionage was the all-consuming threat in the West and in Canada in particular. That was what we worked against various state actors. And there's been an evolution since about the implosion of the Soviet Union, where in fact espionage has become rather passé. It's high risk. It's very difficult to do against hard targets. You have to get people to commit treason. And it's a lot easier with foreign influence. And so what we've seen is, in the last 30 years, is that foreign interference has eclipsed classic espionage as a national security threat, both in terms of its scope and its speed. Why risk stealing another state's secrets when you can influence and manipulate the targeted country's policymakers? You can get close to what we consider the soft underbelly of a state through our democratic institutions. And the People's Republic of China, in this effort, are the A-team. They are the best at this. Their level of sophistication, confidence bordering on arrogance has made them probably the most daunting threat from a foreign intelligence perspective. So while China continues to play chess, Canada plays whack-a-mole. We need to raise our game. Now, there's been some talk recently that we don't have any legislative hammer to hit foreign interference with. There isn't legislation like with espionage and terrorism, and I respectfully disagree with that. If you look at the Security of Information Act, particularly at the back of it, Section 20, subsection 1, I'll just read a little bit of it to you, and Section 3, you have the language that is appropriate, in my opinion, for prosecuting foreign interference. Section 3.1, prejudice to the safety or interest of the state. Anyone who commits offense punishable by 2 years or more to advance a political objective or to benefit a foreign entity. We move to 20, subsection 1. It's an offense if for the benefit of a foreign entity, any inducement or attempt to induce the cause to increase the capacity of a foreign entity that is reasonably likely to harm Canadian interests. So these offenses easily are captured by the Security of Information Act, in my opinion. And I think perhaps this committee or others might want to take a look at some of that. I've highlighted that in the legislation. So we know now this is an existential threat. What really has been done? What's been done since the allegations came out in November? Well, there's been the proposal for a foreign agent registry listing, which has merit. But unless I'm mistaken, there already is a bill in the Senate, there 237, which is a foreign agent registry bill that's been there since August. Why don't we just move it to the Senate, and why don't we just move it to the House of Commons instead of going across the country and having town halls to see what people think of it? I don't mean to be facetious, but I really think if the government wants to have a registry, and I know a lot of Canadians want to, we've already done some groundwork there. We're allocating millions of dollars to the RCMP, I learned last week, with no investigative strategy, no prosecution strategy. We're just saying, here, take this money and use this. 32 years in national security work. Every time we've had a crisis, every time we've had an incident, that's what the government's done. We'll throw money at the RCMP, we'll say, you folks have got to sort that out. And I don't think that's really an appropriate response. We haven't had a national security policy renewed since 2004. That's the first time we ever had a national security policy written. The threat landscape in this country has changed enormously in the last 20 years. Qualitatively, new threats with AI, all sorts of things, and I think Canadians deserve something like that, and it should be a national security policy that is China-centric. I don't mean to sound partisan. I don't mean to blame any particular government. I worked this threat, the PRC, for many, many years. I actually was the national program manager 12, 13 years ago, and it was a different government at the time. And the reaction to foreign interference reporting, as I think has been suggested earlier, was no different than it was today. Nobody home. There really wasn't much of a response. So this really isn't a partisan issue for me. I think this threat and how the government's going to react or reacts to it historically has transcended party and transcended time. And what we really need is a more holistic approach to pushing back against that threat. And finally, I want to say I'm so delighted to be here to speak today, but particularly with Mr. Ho and Mr. Chiu as panel members, and the other fellows as well, of course. But I think it's extremely important that we have Chinese Canadians to have a platform to talk about what's been going on. They need to have a voice, and not simply as some PR exercise to find out, what they think now and then. But these are the people that have been in the crosshairs of the People's Republic of China regime for 30, 40 years. And they're the people that need to come forward, and they need to have the trust and confidence that there's going to be outcomes and there's going to be a follow-up if they're going to take a risk and come forward and say what's happening. So I think not only the government, but I think Canadians, we need to listen to our Canadian Chinese community for once and hear what they have to say.
Thank you, Mr. Stanton. Mr. Wilczynski, like a volcano, you look like you're ready to explode there. You've listened to the other speakers. You're the last.
No,
You have 5 minutes, sir. Go ahead.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to reiterate what Mr. Stanton said and thank Mr. Ho, Mr. Chiu, and Mr. Mann for sharing their experience with foreign interference. It is absolutely essential to listen to the concerns raised by Chinese communities and other communities that are targeted by this interference so that we can counter activities by foreign governments. Let me share with you that in over 30 years in the public service, I have observed the workings of governments from many angles. As Director General of Border Policy at Public Safety, I negotiated security agreements with the United States. I've been the Director General of Security and Intelligence at what is now Global Affairs, an ambassador to a NATO ally, and the Director General of Intelligence Operations at the Communication Security Establishment. I am intimately familiar with the workings of the Canadian security and intelligence community.
Been a consumer of intelligence and have managed intelligence production. I have done so with a focus on equity, diversity, and inclusion. The complexity of foreign interference requires us to understand the links between a wide range of interconnected issues. Foreign interference by hostile state actors, such as the People's Republic of China, is a profound challenge, as we have heard. The security and intelligence community has been responding and speaking about this threat for years. Nevertheless, as my colleagues have so clearly pointed out, much more can be done to address this threat. I'm glad that we're having this national conversation on foreign interference, and we need to listen, as I said, to the lived experiences of affected communities and individuals. What is regrettable is how we got here and how this conversation is unfolding. The illicit disclosure of intelligence, the awkward response by some in government, and hyperbolic accusations against government and its institutions has resulted in a toxic environment that has impeded our ability to address the threat. The tone and content of the conversation has further shaken Canadians' confidence in our democratic institutions. The debate has been reduced to soundbites and tweets. It has become a vehicle for partisanship rather than a forum where we can work together to confront foreign interference, build resilience in our institutions, and restore the shaken confidence in our democracy. Disclosures may have focused national attention on foreign interference, but have also caused damage to our efforts to confront the threat and are incompatible with defending democracy. When as public servants we gain access to classified information, we swear an oath of secrecy. It is an oath to follow the law and a range of compliance measures. To violate that oath with little understanding of the predictable consequences of disclosures is profoundly irresponsible and likely illegal. While I completely understand the frustration about the pace of addressing foreign interference, disclosure of classified intelligence is illegal for a reason. It compromises techniques. It compromises sources and makes them less likely to cooperate with security and intelligence officials. When government officials leak intelligence, it undermines human rights of individuals' name. And as the committee responsible for access to information, privacy, and ethics, I think that that would be particularly of concern to the members of this committee, Mr. Chair. That information is released without due process, without a presumption of innocence, and with no ability to effectively defend themselves. All of this impedes both the specific investigations themselves, as well as the ability to nurture sources in the long run. It is also fundamentally anti-democratic. You cannot say that you are defending democracy while breaking the laws passed by Parliament. As the former Assistant Deputy Minister for People, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at CSE, I know operational security is essential to persons with origins in hostile states. For them, it is a matter of personal and family safety. Disclosures affect them directly and profoundly. Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Chair, because of these issues, I have supported calls for a public inquiry. We need an impartial inquiry to examine what happened and to ensure that we have the tools necessary to preserve the resilience of our democratic institutions in the future. An inquiry would have the opportunity to examine classified information. It should be coordinated with reviews by NCIRA and NCCOB. It should make recommendations that consider the entire threat, not just what happened in 2019 and 2021.
The threats to our democracy are complex, foreign interference is evolving, and inquiry will provide Parliament with options to mitigate the threats and ensure Canadians have confidence that the representatives reflect our popular will. The only ones benefiting from what is happening now are the enemies of democracy. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Wilczynski. For anyone who's been following the committee and for the benefit of the witnesses, I'm kind of old school when it comes to interaction. I don't believe that we need to go through the chair all the time. So any of the questions that happen can be direct. The answers can be direct to the members as well. So with that being said, we're going to start with Mr. Barrett for 6 minutes. Go ahead, sir.
Thanks very much, Chair, and thanks to the witness panel for joining us this morning and providing us with your expertise. Very nice to see you, Mr. Chiu, here today, a former colleague of ours. And thanks for making the trip. It's quite early back home in BC for you, so happy to see you here. I'd like to start with a question for you, Mr. Juneau Katsuya. Do you have evidence of interference or interference attempts, or evidence that Canadian governments have been informed of these activities?
Yes, but I don't have them with me since I was with CSIS. It's remained with CSIS.
Okay. So you don't have any information that you'd be able to transmit to the committee for its review?
Other than the normal briefing has been provided at various time through the last 30 years, all the senior command or the chain of command has spoken to various governments at one point or another. No, I don't have it. It was regular briefing given according to the seriousness of what we had discovered at that period of time.
Do you know how many federal ridings have been targeted by the communist regime in Beijing?
Through the last 30 years, or the recent?
I'm interested in both numbers, actually.
Well, through the years, we have seen similar riding constantly being targeted, particularly where there was a domination or a great number, I should say, of Chinese Canadian residents. These were the hunting ground of the consular office. The work is done by consular officers most of the time, and like I said, we have a certain number, but they were all the time the same ones targeted, and they would fluctuate through time when a specific MP or candidates would present itself newly against the Chinese government, when it was not usual to have aggressions or resistance coming from that riding. But if somebody became vocal, then suddenly they would deploy some effort. But it was fairly stable throughout the entire Canada.
Would you believe it to be productive for you to furnish this committee with a list in writing of those ridings?
I could try to put it together.
Okay, thank you. Are you familiar with the 2022 case of Christine Lee in the United Kingdom? She was the subject of an alert by MI5?
No, I'm not.
Okay, I see Mr. Stanton is nodding. Sir, are you familiar with that case?
Yeah, very much. I mean, I read it. I was following it quite closely, so I read all the media on it.
So you're aware that House of Commons Speaker Hoyle issued an alert to members of Parliament to warn of interaction with Miss Lee?
Yeah.
Similarly, a similar situation, are you aware of an alert that was issued by the Speaker as the result of information by MI5 concerning Russian influence attempts the year prior?
If I'm thinking about the same one, there was a case in Britain, and I think MI5 was involved, but I think from what I've read in the media, it's of questionable accuracy whether this is some, I think, a British subject who's claimed that he reported to MI5 and they didn't take seriously what he was saying?
No, the case that I'm referring to was influence activities targeting 100 members of the UK House by Russian state actors looking to color their perspective of activities of the government of Ukraine. But we'll stick with the situation that you're familiar with.
Okay.
And that's of Miss Lee. So this issue was raised by MI5, brought to the Speaker of the House, and then members were warned. Why do you think that that's not a practice that's employed here in Canada? We've heard testimony here this morning already that there are state actors working at all levels of government in all political parties, and I think that is surprising. That you know, everyone would say, "Oh, it must be in another party. It must have been another government," and members couldn't be blamed for that because we have an intelligence service that's never told us otherwise. So, So why don't we have that process in place here? And if you could keep your remarks pretty tight, I'll try and get to the other two speakers.
I'll be real brief. I think that particular case in Britain was so egregious that they had intelligence that the money that was coming from the United Front Work Department in the PRC through this British citizen going right into an MP's campaign fund. And I think there was probably a lot more going on, but it wasn't hitting any legal thresholds. So the best the British could do was send out this all points bulletin to everybody, identifying her, basically saying, stay away, stay clear. She's a foreign influence actor. Now, I wouldn't say the allegations we have in Canada, based on what looks to be pretty sketchy information coming from the media, dribs and drabs, that the Canadian government would issue something like that. That's just my opinion. But I think the British case was so blatant, it provoked that.
I'm out of time, but I'll circle back on this issue and give you an opportunity to respond. Mr. Wilczynski and Mr. Juneau, Katsuya, thanks for your response.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. And we've got roughly an hour and a half worth of questioning here, so you'll have another chance. Mr. Baines, you're up next for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And, as technology advances and tactics evolve and foreign state relations evolve, like we've heard today, I do believe the threat to democracy is a lot to do with disinformation and misinformation from foreign state actors, non-state actors, and even domestically here. So, we've heard that this has been going on for a long-standing time. So thank you all for joining us here today and for this very important study. My first question is to Mr. Wilczynski, if I said that correctly. We have a strong, vibrant Chinese diaspora in the city that I live in, Richmond, from where Mr. Chiu is also from. Some families have been here for well over 100 years, while some are first-generation Canadians. You wrote in the Ottawa Citizen that Canadians of Chinese descent are the primary victims of interference from the CCP. Can you elaborate on that for the committee? I think we heard a little bit about it before as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the question. The reason I wrote that is based a lot on what you've already heard from, quite frankly, the other witnesses that have spoken firsthand about how they have experienced some of those forms of pressure. And I think that there are many instances in the public domain written by members of the community that have highlighted and enumerated the various ways in which interference has negatively affected, whether it's through intimidation, whether it's through coercion. There have been lots of elements in the public domain. And I think that that's why I think it's really important and why I'm so pleased that Mr. Chiu, Mr. Ho, and Mr. Manthorpe have all been here to share that sort of experience and that research that they have done in terms of the effects that manipulation has had on the community. There are unfortunately too many pressure points that can be exercised by hostile states, and we have to be mindful of them. And I think that's why it's important for us to listen to members of the community as we craft strategies to respond to that kind of threat.
On that note, are there other communities that you think are impacted in the same way?
Yes. And again, it's been mentioned at this table. I do think that, and this is all in the public domain. You don't need to look at classified information because the communities themselves have spoken about it. I believe that the Iranian community has spoken very directly about how they have been affected by foreign interference. We have seen in many instances, also in the public domain, you don't need to go for classified information, how Putin's regime in Russia has tried to influence a wide range of issues that are of interest to that state. And it affects not only, I think, members of ethnocultural communities, but other targeted communities that might be vulnerable to the actions of those hostile states. So I'll elaborate on that if you would like.
Yeah.
Specifically on the last one, I have also in the public domain, I have been particularly critical of the actions of the Russian government as it comes to be targeting the LGBTQ2+ community and trying to highlight, amplify, and specifically undermine Canadians' support for and social cohesion around the equality rights for a historically marginalized community. For me, that might not necessarily be interference so much as malign influence, but it is a hostile activity by a state actor that I think does negatively affect specific Canadians.
And how as MPs can we protect ourselves from bad actors when we aren't provided the tools? So I think one of the issues is, even if we proactively reach out to whether it's public safety agencies or anyone, and we try to ask, like, okay, who do we stay away from? We're not really, that information isn't shared because quite frankly, that it could compromise something. So what can we do as MPs?
Well, I think having these kinds of sessions is profoundly important, and having officials, both current and previous, from the national security and intelligence community to share what they can in a public environment about what the threat is. Personally, I've also believed that there can be far more transparency from Canada's security and intelligence communities. We can and have the ability to speak to the public, to parliamentarians, and to others around the issues of foreign interference in, I think, a more regular and more frank way. I think that part of the challenge has been a long history of reticence and risk aversion when it comes to having those conversations. And I think part of the effects of that history of risk aversion in terms of regularly and more forthrightly having those conversations is that many Canadians, and unfortunately a number of parliamentarians, don't have a deep understanding of the way security and intelligence works and how we can work more effectively together to counter the threat posed by hostile state actors and other threats to Canada's national security.
Okay, how much time?
A minute.
In the same article that I referenced before, you discuss how disclosure of classified documents undermines efforts to address foreign interference. Can you expand on why that is?
Yes, I think that, again, when one sees illicitly disclosed intelligence, there is a lot that intelligence services can determine by having access to that information. They can figure out what the source of the information is. They can figure out who a potential person was that was seeking the information in the first place. So compromising individuals within the security and intelligence community themselves. It can enable, once they acquire that knowledge, they can develop strategies to avoid that similar tactic in the future. And when they avoid those tactics, when those tactics evolve, the ability for security and intelligence services to maintain access, to have transparency and visibility into what they are doing, whether it's through human sources, as happens for organizations such as CSIS, or through signals intelligence, if there's disclosure, again, targets of that intelligence collection can modify their behavior in a way that closes Canada's and our ability to see what they're doing.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Wilczynski and Mr. Baines. Monsieur Villemure, vous avez 6 minutes.
6 minutes, Mr. Villemure. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all the witnesses for being with us, and welcome back, Mr. Juneau Katsuya. I have a few questions for you, and maybe just a yes or no answer, because I have quite a few questions. You stated that all federal governments were compromised by China. Yes? Yes. All governments were informed. Yes. They all chose to ignore CSIS warnings. Yes. They were infiltrated by agents by the Chinese government. Yes. Governments made questionable decisions with regards to this interference. Yes. All governments up till now have been a part of the problem. Yes. You mentioned legislation. The Hong Kong legislation for 2020, in 2020, is that good? Australia, sorry. Yes, Australia 2018. Yes, I think that would be a good start. But Australia has had this legislation for 5 years, and their agents can use it. It can teach us how we can improve things. They have a sunset clause of 5 years. And so we could find some inspiration there. The United States and England have some interesting legislation that we could look to as well in order to have Canadian legislation. You stated as well that an investigation board in its current form would not be good because it is not independent. Yes, so it needs to be independent from the government, CSIS, and the RCMP. Correct. How can that be created? How can this independent office be created? Answer, it's similar to what we have with the Auditor General, somebody who is named by the House of Commons and would report to the House of Commons. But it's to be an investigative office to bring back the integrity to our democratic system that we need. It's essential for Canadians and for our allies. It's important to have that independence and that flexibility, and there needs to be the power to investigate. Somebody who will be there to support what Mr. Wazinski said, to support transparency, which is something that we're lacking. That transparency, for too long in Canada, or that lack of transparency, didn't allow us to share warnings with the population. When CSIS wanted to warn companies, as MI5 does, for example, have a national conference in order to give warnings or share information, well, the opposite was done here and told CSIS that they needed to inform only the government, but CSIS informed the government and nothing happened. Thank you. Microphone, please. The interpreter cannot hear. It would be a great challenge. AI would allow us to get information and identify targets for countries that are against us. It would allow us to collect a lot more data and to target people who could be victims of that foreign interference. The microphone is not working. The interpreter cannot hear.
Avec votre...
Mr. Villemur, your microphone is not working.
Est-ce qu'on peut faire un...
Can we do a test because interpreters cannot hear?
Est-ce qu'il y a deux qui sont ouvertes? Oui. J'ai arrêté le temps aussi.
I stopped your time, Mr. Villemur.
Check, check, check. I think this one, c'est celui-là. OK. Parce qu'il y a deux ouverts ici. Ouais, mais sont gelés. Ils sont gelés? Bon. OK. Non, il veut vraiment pas. Désolé pour ça. OK, celui-là ici? Oui, celui-là.
Pour les interprètes, est-ce que...
Can the interpreters hear? Thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Villemur. Mr. Chiu, you mentioned that you proposed C-282. What happened with that bill?
Nothing. It's just set on the House of Commons floor, and with the Prime Minister pulling the plug on 43rd Parliament, it just went away.
Est-ce que vous avez eu des...
were there any consequences for you personally for tabling such a bill?
As I mentioned during the election, there had been significant amount of disinformation being spread, especially with the diaspora Chinese community through WeChat primarily, but also on WhatsApp. And I've been mischaracterized as somebody who's anti-Chinese and even hating Chinese, that I must not be allowed to be reelected, myself and also then Conservative leader Aaron O'Toole.
Donc, vous êtes de première.
So, you're sharing your testimony here with us, correct?
That is correct.
OK. Donc,
Can you say that you were a victim of foreign interference during the previous election?
I would say it played a role in my defeat. And I was actually glad that there was a whistleblower in CSIS, because to a certain extent it confirmed my subjective observation.
OK.
And also the intelligence that we, the local campaign, have received and reported to CSIS all along, even though that CSIS has never got back to us.
Donc, vous croyez?
So you believe that your opponent had an advantage?
Yes, that he is the beneficiary of the disinformation.
OK. Croyez-vous que ce soit
Do you believe that it's a conflict of interest that your opponent is here today?
That is a question I think it's better answered by my opponent, who is sitting here in the meeting.
D'accord.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Villemur. Your time is up.
J'ai arrêté le temps.
I had stopped your time and restarted it, so it has been 6 minutes. Thank you.
Mr. Green, you have 6 minutes. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the witnesses for being here. Obviously, lots has been reported on publicly, lots of opinions floating around. It's good to have some subject matter expertise. I particularly enjoy the opportunity to have former members of our security apparatus here before us. I talk often about the duty of candor, which you are legislated to extend to the courts. I wish we had a deeper commitment from our security apparatus to have the same duty of candor to Parliament. Perhaps we may be able to avoid situations like this in the future. Mr. Stanton, in an interview in CBC Radio, you stated that Canada needs to amend its CSIS Act to empower national security agencies to deal with foreign influence, not just foreign interference. And I think that's an important point. Can you please explain the difference between foreign influence and foreign interference?
So I just missed the last few words. I don't remember suggesting the CSIS Act be amended, but are you just asking me what's the difference between foreign interference and foreign influence?
Yes, please.
Yeah, well, good question. There's sort of two types of foreign interference. The first one, which is kind of the easy one, is where the foreign state is basically targeting the diasporic communities relating to homeland issues. This could be manipulation, intimidation, and they don't want to talk about it, and they're used. And so CSIS will target that type of activity, and it's usually dealt with fairly well. It's a less nuanced threat than the other foreign interference. The other foreign interference, probably the reason we're here in these committee meetings, is where you've got the state targeting 3 levels of government, targeting politicians, targeting journalists, all sorts of walks of life, and using clandestine methods. There has to be clandestine activity, otherwise it's simply lobbying. And that's why there's been, I would say, such a lack of government reaction to the reporting over years, because if you look at it at a cursory glance, it appears to be just lobbying, and what's the big deal? Don't you people have more important things to talk about? But if you work it for a long while, and if you use that criteria of clandestinity, where the agenda of the foreign state is not clear to the target, then you can see the threat manifestation. And so that's what we're dealing with more, is the other type of foreign interference, which is very hard to identify and can be difficult to counter. Although I do say we have legislation that can be brought into bear, as opposed to the other foreign interference, which is a little more in your face. And that's where you have a representative of foreign state directly intimidating part of that community in Canada.
And for the purpose that you had referenced AI, I attended a workshop this week on Russian interference and Russian actors online, particularly with troll farms and social media. We know that at least in a cursory way through the convoy, there had been massive spikes in online presence from Russia in that regard. Can you maybe just share the way in which technology and social media have helped blur the lines between influence and interference in terms of being able to know what is clandestine?
I have to say, actually, that's not an area I really have a lot of background on in terms of the technology aspect of disinformation, but I
can try and answer part of that. I think that, again, the online environment is obviously fairly complex, and it's evolving. I think the important part to understand is when it's inauthentic behavior, when countries use various tools to amplify either covertly messages that they know run counter to the interests of the countries that they're targeting, or specifically amplify their own interests. It is a combination of, again, inauthentic activity with like things such as bots, but it also can be understanding that they've cultivated a range of supportive actors within a state that will amplify those messages for it. So sometimes what would be inauthentic behavior may actually look authentic because it is being amplified by legitimate actors in a certain state. It's all going to be made much more complex, as colleagues have mentioned, by AI. Everything from deep fakes, the ability, I was on the front page of the Citizen the other day, when images and videos are going to be manipulated in such a way that it'll be very difficult to tell the difference, what is real, what is fake. Using those kinds of tools in combination with the kind of amplification they can use in an online environment is going to make it particularly challenging, I think, for average citizens and also for national security and intelligence organizations to be able to constrain and address that behavior. It's something that we have to pay particular attention to into the future.
If I recall, there's a famous Steve Bannon quote that talks about, cognitive warfare, trying to create complete chaos and disorder. This was coming from somebody who at the time was a key American advisor to an American regime. We've spent a lot of time focused on China. Can we perhaps take a moment and step back and just maybe provide a bit of an overview about other international actors, both those that we may consider to be friendly and allies and hostile actors, because it feels like we're missing a pretty significant part of the equation here when we only focus on one country, given the global complexity of this kind of zero-sum game.
If I can, I'll just jump very, very quickly on that. I am particularly worried about non-state actors, and particularly non-state actors from friendly states. I think that it doesn't take a big stretch to see how ideologically motivated violent extremist organizations, particularly those based in the United States, are trying to amplify certain messages that divide, that target minority communities, whether or not it's promoting anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, homophobia, transphobia, undermining democratic principles and values. Lots of folks are out there doing so in a non-transparent way. They're not state actors, so therefore the ability for governments like ours to address it are a challenge, and that's one of the things that I think an inquiry should look at as well.
Thank you, Mr. Wilczynski. Mr. Green, we're going to move to our second round of questioning and start with Mr. Kirk. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and let me thank all of our witnesses for joining us here today and talking about this very important subject. Mr. Chiu, it's good to see you again, and as a former colleague, it's nice to have you before this committee. I did want to provide you maybe a little bit of an opportunity just to share your experience, what the attacks against you and your personal character looked like, specifically during the last election, and the issues surrounding your proposal for a foreign agents registry. If you could unpack in about a minute or so the impacts that had both you professionally and personally.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. It's good to see everybody as well. I think I would characterize it as an isolation process. Partly it's due to the COVID pandemic, but on the other hand, I used to serve on the Chinese ethnic media quite frequently and actively. But during my term, especially after I table the private member bill, foreign influence registry, I've been given the cold shoulder in many of the Chinese media, and they don't invite me to their talk shows. And even though they open their lines for criticism of my bill, and all that culminated during the election of these disinformation that, I haven't never been to Xinjiang, so how could I be voting with the rest of the parliamentarian that there is a genocide fulfilling the definition as by the UN? And also, why would I hate my own race, Chinese, that I actually put into place this Chinese registry, this foreign influence registry? It served as a big impact because I left my profession as the software development middle management personnel, and it's difficult to get back to my profession. However, I'm actually glad that this issue was being able to table on the national discussion scene has been previously mentioned. To many of us, this may sound like everything, everywhere, all at once. But to many of us in the community, it's everything, everywhere, all the time.
Much, Mr. Chiu, and I'd like to dig down a little bit on the ethnic media side of things. And Mr. Ho, you had mentioned some about that. Could you describe for the benefit of the committee how this process is used or weaponized for the benefit of the communist dictatorship in Beijing?
Oh yeah. The basic principle for the CCP is to intimidate the so-called quote-unquote hostile voices in our Chinese community. And on the other hand, they manipulate the disinformation or misinformation, even fake news on their social media, like WeChat, like other, even TikTok, to spread the official propaganda to, just sidetrack the core problem. For example, in the COVID-19 era, they spread the anti-Asian hate campaign. This is a national campaign, even a transnational campaign, even in United States, anti-Asian hate campaign, and put the agenda into a racial issue rather than a pandemic, the public health issue. And on the election period, they just color the anti or opposite views in the Chinese community, that is anti-CCP action or commentary as a racial problem, and just
if I could, I hate to interrupt, but time is short here. Just a quick follow-up to that. Is this something that, because it's often in languages certainly that many Canadians wouldn't understand, Mandarin, Cantonese, etc., is this something that is the sort of thing that hides in plain sight, Mr. Ho?
Quick answer, please, Mr. Ho.
Oh yeah, this is an ethnic language problem. So the mainstream society have no idea on what happened in our Chinese community.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Carrot.
Past years.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Fergus, 5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I would also like to thank all the witnesses for being with us today. It's greatly appreciated. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us. I would like to start with Mr. Wilczynski. You said that the way that things happened creates an issue for public safety and is a violation of human rights in Canada. Can you tell us more? I tried to explain a little earlier. I think that is fundamental for me is respecting the legislation. It's fundamental to our democracy. We respect legislation in place. They give us a framework on how to act as agents of public security. We have the ability to carry out investigations and ways to advance our interests.
Do not follow the law, when they do not respect the rules by which we have been appropriately constrained and the compliance that we have put in place to measure our behavior, the effects are multiple, particularly, I think, on human rights of individuals. So when it's a government official using the powers, the authorities to access information, and then on their own, outside of the framework of the laws that govern us, decides to provide that information without context and without explanation and without analysis to a public domain, that violates a whole range of not only their obligations, but the rights of the individuals named in those disclosures, the rights to privacy, the rights to due process. And I think that is profoundly troublesome when people working in security and intelligence in particular, an enterprise that has had a challenging history in Canada, to do so outside the rule of law, again, is why I think it's fundamentally anti-democratic. And I do want to pick up just, sorry, very quickly on the earlier question, because it's related to it, like one of the effects. And I mentioned it a bit in my statement. We in the security intelligence community need far greater diversity in our ranks, precisely so that we are able to understand language, cultural context, to be able to provide the kind of insight that is essential. But when members of those community feel that we have not lived by the rule of law, where we have not protected them to the extent that we need to, our ability to entice them to come and join us and be members of the Security Intelligence Service is negatively affected, and that in turn negatively affects our ability to be effective protectors of Canadian national interests.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you very much. And I saw many people nodding. Mr. Stanton, you talked a lot in the media about these CSIS leaks, quote unquote. Do you believe that these leaks are coming from CSIS? Why or why not?
No, I don't. I don't believe they're coming. And I'll be careful how I answer this because I've been following this quite closely. You've got two different lines of, we'll call it reporting with allegations, and there's qualitative differences in it. And people that work in intelligence and professions like CSIS, they don't get worked up about outcomes. You work counterterrorism. In some cases, you're indifferent really whether someone's going to be arrested and go to jail. I remember when 18 Soviet diplomats were kicked out, and I was actually working a Soviet section. I was working the KGB desk. And I think I was saddened for about 3 weeks that it had to happen because there was all sorts of investigative equities in there and all sorts of things that go on in counterintelligence beyond kicking a diplomat out. The same with someone being arrested or charged or various things. People that work in intelligence are professional. They're not thinking about outcomes that some policymaker may or may not carry. And I know that because I spent 32 years in there. I know the culture. But I also look at some of the stuff that's been in the media where we now have this leaker idolatry, where they're sort of held up as patriots who are sort of outraged by this egregious cover-up and that they're going to now protect Canadians through the leakage. That also doesn't sound like people that I know and a culture that I worked with for many, many years. And I mean, I could read a lot into the testimonial in the Globe. I can read a lot into the Globe's editorials on the subject as well. There's a little bit of a slant towards Essa and Leavelin and things like that, a little bit partisan. So I sort of have an idea in my mind where these leaks are coming. In some cases where they're coming through various filters to the Reuters reporter. In some cases, it may be a document. And I'm quite confident that the organization I spent a lot of time in is not the source of those leaks. Some of it could be attributed, maybe some third party, but I don't believe that the documents are coming from the organization.
Thank you, Mr. Stanton. Merci, Monsieur Fergus.
Thank you, Mr. Fergus. Mr. Villemur, you have 2.5 minutes, please. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Manthorpe, I greatly appreciated your comments. You talked a lot about trust and confidence. Considering the current situation and leaks, allegations, and all those kinds of things, what could help us to build trust in our institutions?
That's a very broad question, and I appreciate it. I'm actually in the middle of writing another book about the problems of Canadian democracy, which maybe we can talk about when the book comes out. But I think we do have a problem of trust in our institutions and our democratic institutions that goes beyond foreign interference. And I think that there have been several people have mentioned this morning that it's not just the People's Republic of China that has perhaps gone beyond the bounds of lobbying and into the area of serious interference in Canadian public life. And I think that perhaps we do need a registry just for that reason, that it is this is a general problem and not something deeply concerned with or only concerned with the People's Republic of China. But I think the level of trust in our institutions has degraded over the last 20, 30 years for various reasons, perhaps more than is appropriate to go in with this committee today. But I wrote a book which came out in 2020 called Restoring Democracy, which looked at the whole period from the end of the Cold War and the various pressures on democracy in the last 30 years. My latest book, which hopefully will come out next year, sort of deals particularly with Canada in that context. But I suspect that this may not be a matter for this committee at this moment. But I'll happily answer any other questions you have.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Manthorpe.
Monsieur Villemur.
Thank you, Mr. Villemur. Mr. Green?
Thank you. Mr. Stanton, could you maybe, in picking up on this line of questioning, could you perhaps expand on other foreign agents or countries or actors that are out there that we should be focused on? My concern, and maybe you can comment on this because I've heard a lot about it, is that we're solely focused on China, and I think in doing so, we may miss the broader picture. Can you comment on that?
Sure, great question. I think we're solely focused on China because it is, as I said, the A-team when it comes to foreign interference. There is absolutely no comparison in terms of scope and qualitative differences. But, one of my colleagues alluded to Iran. We've seen a shift in Iranian interference where they're now contracting out in the private sector. This is in the media, both in Canada, US, and Britain. They're using private investigators to follow people. And so there's some shifts in how they do this, which is related to harassing and doing worse with dissidents. Russia's always been a player, but Russia's very strong on the intel and their intelligence services. It's somewhat different than the way they do things than with China. One country I'll say is India. India does foreign interference in Canada. We've seen this. We've seen this in the media. And so there's a number of foreign states, as one of my colleagues says, they're not necessarily all hostile to Canadian interests. Some of them are kind of, I guess you could say, neutral. Some of them could be allied. But it's kind of, I don't know, it's kind of hit and miss in some areas. And I don't want to go back to belaboring PRC, although that is the reason we're here. They just do it extremely well. They really do. It's a whole of government, whole society approach. You know about the national security law that was passed in 2017, where anyone with Chinese status anywhere in the world has to cooperate. But there are other players. It's just not the same depth.
In your opinion, if we're dealing with the Apex A-team in this, and we're providing legislative recommendations and frameworks from this committee in dealing with China as a case study, is it your opinion that we would then cover off all of them, or is the differences that you identified between the way in which different foreign actors operate, is that going to require a broader understanding of the different tactics and strategies used in order to safeguard our democracy?
Yeah, I think in the general macro sense, yes, we have to have these legislative tools. We have to have a capability of enforcement. We have to have some end games on that. And so you could use that template with other states. It's just the, there's a deterrence effect as well when you have legislation. You can use that to sort of mitigate a bit of the threat, but they are different. Russians are different. Russians operate differently, and the Iranians clearly operate differently. So I wouldn't want to suggest that we, have some sort of broad review of all the state actors and try to come up with some common approach on things. I think what we really should do is deal with what we're seized with right now, which of course is the PRC.
Thank you, Mr. Stanton. Mr. Green, we're going to go to Mr. Brock. Welcome to committee. Mr. Brock, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to thank all of the witnesses for your attendance and participation in this important study. I'd like to start off by saying hello to Mr. Chiu, and I have a number of questions for you, sir. So I understand that it wasn't just yourself that was impacted by foreign election interference, but in fact your former colleagues Alice Wong and Bob Soraya. Now, I've done a little bit of research. I understand that all three of those ridings have a very large Chinese-Canadian population. Can you opine as to what you believe to be one of the factors or a number of factors that contributed to the number of traditional conservative Canadians in those ridings that for whatever reason simply did not vote? I understand there was a substantial drop in the percentage of voting, not only in your riding, but Ms. Wong's and Mr. Soraya's. Can you offer some information on that for me, please?
Absolutely. I think there has been study conducted that shows across Canada, wherever there is a high concentration of Chinese population ridings with that, the number of support that the Conservative in 2021 has received has dropped, bucking the trend of all the other ridings in the neighboring ridings where those ridings are. And I think this is the effect of the disinformation that's been spread. Yes, they target specific candidates such as myself in ridings that I represent or I was running, but at the same time they would also generalize this and use it across Canada in many of the Chinese ridings to indicate that the party itself, the leadership itself, they have taken an anti-Chinese role, and the fact that they've misconstrued that Mr. O'Toole, the Conservative, will ban WeChat. Consider, put yourself in their shoes. If you rely on WeChat for the only lifeline to connect to your family and conduct business in Canada, and if a political party will do that, and that particular party, there's an MP that proposed a foreign registry that would put you and your descendants into jeopardy, would you be voting for that, even though they align very well with your value? So I believe across the country, it actually has hurt many of riding, even though we have won but potentially with a smaller margin.
Okay. I guess it really highlights the importance of social media to Chinese Canadians, particularly the platform of WeChat. Were there other platforms of social media or other ways that they spread the message that you ought not to be considering conservatives in the next election?
It's not just WeChat. It's not just social media. It's multidimensional. It's on the airwave that CRTC is supposed to be regulating. It's on printed media. It's also on websites. These multidimensional disinformation campaigns help to solidify the mistrust on certain particular politicians or political party, and it's very effective, especially during election time.
Was any of these issues prevalent in your election success in 2019? Did you feel the pressures from Beijing?
In 2015, I actually had an opportunity to sit down with the Consul General in Vancouver. I believe she was trying to size me up back then. But in 2019, they have decided that I'm completely beyond hope. So the information that I've got from my Chinese supporter has been that they've told people not to vote for me, but there is no active campaign against me that I can observe.
In 2019, NSICOP, the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, which is made up of parliamentarians of every stripe, studied the whole issue of foreign election interference and made a number of recommendations that would appear that the Liberal government did not follow through on. Our Prime Minister, most recently, in light of all of the information that has been leaking, has indicated that he has to do a better job and follow the recommendations. How does that make you feel, sir, knowing that the Prime Minister who had this information 4 years ago essentially ignored all of those recommendations?
Very quick response, please, Mr. Chiu, if you don't mind.
Thank you. I try to be as nonpartisan as I can, but frankly, being a targeted person and a particular ethnic race, I feel I'm vulnerable. That my government is not there to protect me when it's needed.
Thank you, Mr. Chiu. Mr. Brock, Mr. Baines, you have 5 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Like as candidates, we're all victims of misinformation and disinformation. When we're in an election and there were campaign against me that I was going to legalize hard drugs and things of that nature. But I want to go back to maybe Mr. Stanton, because the community I live in has Filipino, Indo-Canadian, Hong Kong, mainland China, strong Muslim Canadian community. We actually have a 5-kilometer corridor in the city. It's called the Highway to Heaven, and it's every religious institution, about 28 of them, all along this corridor. So it's a very, very mixed community that I've lived in my whole life. So it's important to me. I think we had a list of all the nations you were talking about, including USA, India, PRC, Iran, Russia. So like, are there more than that we need to be mindful of? And I understand you've said that China is number one, they're the A team, but are there others that are maybe developing a little bit more? Because it's clear Canada is, as we've said for many years now, you're saying long-standing target. Everybody wants to trade, everybody wants to get an advantage. So are there other nations that are emerging?
Yeah, I would say in terms of foreign interference as it's defined in the CSIS Act Section 2, no, there aren't a lot others. We have to also bear in mind foreign states do want to influence what goes on in Canada. That is part of normal diplomacy and engagement. And, you know, it's no surprise certain state would probably, with a particular diaspora community, want to have some engagement there. And the service is only looking at it when there's evidence of clandestine activity and things like that. So I would say probably on a positive note, no, and I wouldn't say a lot of those communities are targeted by, let's say, their foreign state equivalent in interfering in that. It's just a few principal ones. But bear in mind, CSIS doesn't look at elections, which you'll be happy to know. They're just looking at the target of a threat, the individual who may happen to run for office or who may happen to do that. So they don't have investigations where they're looking at communities and you know, the politics that goes on and things like that.
Did you want to add to?
Yes, I would like. Yes, I would
Okay,
like to
sure.
add.
Yeah, go
To complete a little bit, Mr. Stanton comment, there is other countries as well that has been identified. Radio Canada in Montreal, for example, has found out that Rwanda had sent 3 agents in the community to monitor, intimidate, and report. We have Saudi Arabia, for example, sending people as well to do exactly the sign of bullying in the community and being very aggressive in that perspective. Dan has mentioned also India, very, very, very active as well in the community. And that's been for decades in that perspective. We could go on like this as well. And there's also some friends. France, for example, has been doing it as well for since Vive le Québec libre. So we've been subject of those kind of foreign interference for a long period of time. Unfortunately, we don't have the tools to investigate properly. Unfortunately, even the $50 million that will be given to the RCMP will be to do what? Simply take the complaint? Because we don't have anything to sort of put it against a law that will be capable to punish the people, because they're not only foreign states, they are also agent recruited by that are Canadians acting on behalf of those foreign states. And that's where we lack very much.
The only thing that I'd add to what my colleagues have said is that we shouldn't only be looking backward at the actors that have in the past targeted our democratic institutions. We need to look how the threat to our democracy is evolving and how technology is going to, quite frankly, democratize the ability for hostile actors, state and non-state, to undermine confidence in our democracy and undermine the social cohesion that holds Canadians together.
Yeah, and that's why I was trying to find out the emerging other nations that are there, and that's why it's important for me to be here.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Baines. We've got about 35 minutes left. We're going to go to the next round and start with Mr. Barrett for 5 minutes. Go
I
ahead.
can take the full 35, Chair. Okay.
Any objection?
Yeah.
Okay.
A few, so I have several questions, noting that I only have 5 minutes. A few quick yes or no, if I could, from you, Mr. Juneau Katsuya. Is it your belief that the current Prime Minister knew about foreign interference, not influence attempts in the 2019 and 2021 federal elections?
Well, I wouldn't be able to say if Mr. Trudeau was informed. I can only go with the allegation that were demonstrated presented. Sorry,
based on your, pardon me for interrupting. Based on your experience over the last 30 years, would it be your belief that he would have been briefed on it?
Yes.
Do you believe that sufficient action, or do you believe that sufficient action was taken in response to it by the government?
Nope.
Do you believe that, based on media reports and on your experience, that the current government benefited in any way from interference attempts in the 2019 or 2021 elections?
Potentially.
We know that the CCP undertook a campaign to gain influence with Mr. Trudeau through clandestine funding of his family foundation, the Trudeau Foundation. Do you believe that that campaign has been effective?
Yes.
Mr. Stanton, thank you, sir. Mr. Stanton, in June of 2017, it's been reported that the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff requested a brief on foreign interference in Canadian politics, and that briefing said that there's a substantial, are you familiar with this, sir?
Not really.
You're not familiar with the
No.
reporting of this?
No.
Any of the panelists familiar with the reporting of the 2017 request for a brief by Ms. Telford on foreign interference in elections?
Nope.
Okay. Moving on. How would the Prime Minister, based on your experience in the security apparatus, how would a Prime Minister or their staff be briefed on foreign interference issues by CSIS? Well, specifically, like who from CSIS typically, like what level of individual would deliver that briefing to a Prime Minister?
Sorry, who are you asking?
Anyone who has an answer.
I don't have an answer from my experience of what particular vehicles of briefing or personnel. I know that, I mean, CSIS provides a whole range of intelligence products, from assessment to raw. You'll be looking at the Privy Council office, you'll be looking at various departments.
Okay.
So how that would make its way to the Prime Minister or the Prime Minister's National Security Advisor, I really have no insight.
Okay. Do you believe that the scientists, Mr. Stanton, are you familiar with the
Yes,
case
I am.
of the Winnipeg lab?
Yeah.
And that there were, that on CSIS's information, two scientists were fired or removed from their employment there?
Yes, I'm aware. Yeah.
Do you believe that they were CCP agents?
Not necessarily. Here's what I believe based on the media reports. I've been following it. The service provided advice in terms of a clearance, whether it's a clearance renewal or whether it's a clearance, which goes to the deputy head of the department. And it's their decision what to do. It's not CSIS' decision. They simply say, we would recommend perhaps not a renewal. And then I think these two individuals basically returned to mainland China.
So they're not still in, your belief is that they're not still in Canada?
Well, from what I've read in the media, it looks like no one's around. And I think the fact no charges have been laid might reflect that. But I look at this and I see, okay, there was an issue there. Perhaps proprietary information was sent back to China. Who knows? It probably doesn't meet the threshold of espionage.
Okay. I just have about 30 seconds left.
Okay.
So in my previous round of questions, I talked about this issue of MI5 and the FBI making a public announcement with respect to that foreign agent acting in the UK. So those are two of our Five Eyes partners who are publicly communicating on issues of foreign influence and foreign interference. Yet it's radio silence, and then we're left to question whether or not we have CSIS agents who are leaking because we don't have anyone from CSIS who's actually speaking to the real issues that we all know for a fact are happening and being perpetrated on this country by state actors from around the world, including from Beijing. How do we fix that?
And here's my answer.
It's got to be real quick.
It'll be really quick. In those cases, those allied releases, it was probably based on very convincing intelligence, probably corroborated intelligence, so they did the release. All we're getting through the media, all due respect, is allegations. So why the Canadian government wouldn't make these warnings and send emails to everybody, it may be because there just wasn't meeting that threshold of solid, reliable intelligence that MPs need to be advised.
Thank you. Sorry, Mr. Wilczynski. Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Next, we're going to go to Ms. Martinez Ferrada. You have 5 minutes, please. Go ahead.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll share my 5 minutes with Mr. Fergus. I wanted to speak about Mr. Chiu's electoral campaign. You said that there was interference in different WeChat groups. Here's a question for you. When looking at the results of the election, you saw that the Liberal and the NDP vote had greatly increased. Do you not believe also that voters simply wanted to vote for a progressive government? And maybe it was a reflection of the Conservative Party's position on LGBT communities or other political issues. Is it really interference? That's the reason of that.
Question. If you look into the election results in 2021, the fact that the number of voters turnout has actually dropped significantly. There is a 3,000 vote less in 2021 versus 2019. In as well, my supporters, the one who voted me in 22 months prior to the 2021 election in 2019, I have 4,400 fewer voters. My opponent, the one who actually took the writing, had increased the support by a mere 1,800 votes. That is a significant discrepancy. In other words, there are many conservative supporters who actually stay at home.
Et le vote du NPD, vous n'êtes pas d'accord aussi?
And what about the NDP vote? You're not in agreement also that the votes of the NDP also increased as well? One minute, please, Mr. Chiu. Monsieur Villemur.
On est dans le sujet.
It seems to me that this is Proc's topic. This is not the scope of our our committee study. We're looking at interference in general.
We do give a little bit of latitude to members of parliament to deal with their specific questions. I've stopped the clock. You have 2 minutes and 48 seconds, Madame Martinez-Ferretta.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je vais donner...
Thank you. I'll give the rest of my time to Mr. Fergus. Perfect. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Ferreira-Martinez. Mr. Stanton, your answer to my last question has really sparked my curiosity. I know you have had a long and distinguished career with CSIS, and you've said that a CSIS agent, in your opinion, is not at the origin of these leaks. Who do you think is behind those leaks? You said what it isn't, or who it isn't. Well, then who is it?
No idea. I don't know. I just really have no respect for this at all. I think there's an awful lot of damage that's being done. I could carry on from some things Arthur has mentioned, but I have no respect for it. I do think the profile of the leaker, I can provide that. It's someone who's seeing a small piece. It's someone who's not privy to the big picture. They don't see all the work and all the effort that goes into countering certain threats. And they're just seeing a little piece of the pie. And then on their own, I'd say somewhat arrogantly, decided that they have the prerogative to inflict this damage for whatever cause they may have. And I think some of this is being filtered a little bit, and a little bit embellished by the media to provide a certain nobility to it. And we may find when the dust settles, it's not such a big personality that did this. It may be someone who's just got a little slight, maybe didn't get enough attention. I really don't put a lot of respect in what this person or people are doing. And that's not the reason I'm saying, oh, it's not CSIS, because I worked in CSIS and we're all wonderful. But people work in the business don't get mad and angry. They'll go take mindfulness or something if they do. They don't decide, oh, this is terrible. They're not responding to our reporting, and then they're going to go to the media. I really don't think so, because we're talking about professionals. The Canadian intelligence community is professionals. Not necessarily the person leaking it is involved in the collection or the assessment. They may just be seeing reports, and they want to use this for a certain agenda. They may even be manipulating the media as well, if I may say so, as far as the control of the whole thing. But I'm convinced it's someone that's not in the service. As far as speculation, Ottawa's a big town, and there's a lot of paper that was circulating. Although I imagine right now there's probably not a lot of paper being circulated and shared. But it's anybody's guess. But I think it's somebody who's got an agenda.
Thank you,
and
Mr.
I think they
Stanton.
want to, yeah, that's enough. Yeah.
Okay, I'll see, Monsieur.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Mr. Fergus. Mr. Vilmore, you have 2.5 minutes. Thank you very much. Mr. Juneau Katsuya, you've drawn the portrait, and I want to ask you, what would be the risk if we would not put together this independent investigative office? Answer, it would be extremely damageable to national security. If I may use an analogy that may make you laugh a bit, let's say you're dropping crumbs in your kitchen and you have ants approaching. 2 or 3 ants, not an issue. If you don't pick up the crumbs, if you don't tidy up, then you're going to have an infestation of ants. And if you wait too long, then you'll need the pest control specialists. Same thing here applies here. As Mr. Stanton mentioned, the scope of Chinese intelligence is huge. It is probably the most formidable opponent in the history of humanity. Why? Because they have such means. Also, they work very subtly. And finally, there's also the scope of their foreign interference operation, but they're far from being the only group working thus. As we've said, many countries are doing the same. There's a huge difference between influencing and interfering, and we need to be aware of that difference, of that nuance, so that we can actually act against interference. Thank you very much. Following my colleague across this question, do you believe that these leaks are coming from CSIS? answer. I couldn't say for sure. I do agree with Mr. Stanton that the information could have been gleaned upon by somebody in the bigger community of intelligence. It's hard to know. It's hard to pinpoint. Would you like to add something? Yes, I would like to react to your question to my colleague, Mr. Juneau Katsuya, regarding the creation of a new organization. I believe there would be risks if we were to create a new institution to manage interference. We need to recognize that we have independent police forces, we have CSIS that have their act that governs their action. And when we create something new with new mandates, the risk that we run is that our objectives will be harder to achieve as opposed to just giving better directions to the institutions that already exist, like CSIS and the RCMP. It's interesting because we've heard that for the last 30 years, doing this has not worked. Answer, yes, absolutely. There are challenges in the way the issue is being managed now, fair. But that doesn't mean that we need to throw out the model of an independent intelligence service that has governing acts and laws that tell them how to act. I think that as parliamentarians, there's a way for you to give better directions, clear directions to the intelligence community with clearer thresholds for investigation so that we can really, truly address the problem. I've had, as a public servant of 30 years, I see there's always an issue when we create new institutions. Thank you.
A little more than 2.5 minutes. There's a little bit of latitude there on that time, so I'll give you about 3 minutes, sir. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. Mr. Juneau Katsuya, you had mentioned, you'd raised the issue, I think, around nomination processes. I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about how foreign interference can happen at the first start of an electoral process, which is the nomination process.
Well, basically, what we know and what we realize is that we have foreign agent and even diplomats engage into foreign intelligence activities that are capable to identify and maybe even to farm out individuals that will be capable to simply position themselves. The concept of infiltrating a mole into either an intelligence service or a government is very, very old. We've been doing that
more specifically and more succinctly, just on the process. I think you talked about having citizens versus non-citizens voting in nominations. What's been your experience of nomination processes being directed or guided or influenced by foreign actors through pressure to vote for certain candidates over others?
Well, it's the concept. There's many different operations that has been done. It's the concept of having agent of influence capable to sort of guide or misguide certain individuals. Back in 1995, for example, I was working on a specific file, a Sidewinder, and I discovered in Election Canada that the Embassy of China was giving that year money to the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party at the same time because they were going to nourish influence within those political party. Back in the mid-90s, the Chinese government were very clumsy in the way to do it. They became very, very much more sophisticated, and they have increased the amplitude of their operations to a size that is difficult to capture now, even by our active intelligence services. So,
Mr. Stan, if I only got 10 seconds left. Mr. Stan, have you been ever aware of foreign actors? I know in Ontario, there were allegations around Patrick Brown using foreign nationals during the nomination processes. Is that something that's ever been flagged across your desk?
No, I mean, I've been retired from the service for a few years, but no, again, it goes back to, CSIS doesn't look at elections. They don't look at processes. So in the course of investigating an individual target, no, I'm not aware of that coming across the radar. And issues that the service would get involved with as to who's voting at a nomination or who's donating, what status do they have. They wouldn't, this is politically explosive issue, but from a threat perspective, in a way, it's kind of low-hanging fruit. It's not really, how should I put it? Well, it's not a priority to get in and investigate it in that type of detail. And so again, they're focused on the target, not what's going on in election.
Got you.
Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you, Mr. Stanton.
Thank you.
Mr. Green. Next, we're going to go to Mr. Kirk for 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Mayerthorpe, the Winnipeg Labs issue, it's been asked to a number of the other candidates, but specifically I'd like to ask for if you could, in about a minute or a minute and a half, talk about some of the concerns that have been highlighted about that and how that, because of what was an election call, that issue just kind of disappeared after the last election, and then some of the other techniques that the communist dictatorship in Beijing uses to influence university campuses and whatnot. I'm wondering if in about a minute or minute and a half, if you could maybe expand on some of that, Mr. Mayerthorpe.
Yeah, I don't have any direct information about the Winnipeg situation, but it does fit into a pattern which goes back to really it actually goes back to the 1940s and 50s, but particularly after diplomatic recognition in 1970, when very soon afterwards there were arrangements made for exchange of students and of researchers. What is very noticeable is that the Canadians who went to China went to study language and culture, and the Chinese who came here gravitated towards the technical faculties of universities and institutions, and that has carried on. And of course, as we know, it has also involved more lately Chinese or Communist Party associated institutions financing research here, using our expertise to their own ends, and often the patents that have resulted from that research go to the People's Republic of China. They have not stayed here. So it's a very broad effort here in our technical institutions, and also, of course, it has been accompanied by a very large influx of Chinese undergraduate students, and with the result that a lot of the revenue of some of our universities, in some universities, more than half the tutorial revenue comes from foreign students, and in some cases, most of that comes from China. So it's been a very, very persistent and lengthy effort to use our universities to their own ends.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Mayerthorpe. Mr. Stanton, my colleague, Mr. Barrett, had mentioned, were you still at CSIS in 2017?
That's the year I left.
That's the year
Yeah.
Okay.
But I might have been, no, yeah, 2017, October 2017.
Okay. So Mr. Barrett had mentioned a 2017 briefing that had mentioned that there was a substantial body of evidence that the CCP and their officials were pursuing a strategy to influence Canadian officials. Are you aware of what that body of evidence may be or what it would include?
I was working in a field office. I really don't know. I have no idea.
Okay. Thank you for that. Now, Mr. Chiu, I wanted to, in about the minute or minute and a half that I've left, we've heard about the bill that you tabled about the Foreign Influence Registry. I'm wondering if you could, in 60 seconds or so, just expand a little bit about why you believe that would be an important tool to help restore some of the trust that Canadians need in their democratic institutions.
It will be consistent with what CSIS have been advising the leadership of our country, that sunshine is the best disinfectant. With openness and transparency is the best way to deal with foreign interference issues, and also regain many of the lost trust of Canadians to the institution. Also remove, the political partisanship from all the issues. This information is used when it's most effective, when it's in the shadow, it's under the table, but also at the same time, by repeating itself, it's becoming more and more effective. And so by having a registry, allowing our society, the investigative journalist, to be able to look at that. For example, through my research, I was able to find that the Liberal Party of Canada had an entry in the United States FARA, the Foreign Agent Registry entry in 2019, fundraising among the Canadian diaspora there. So transparency like that would help definitely protect our institution's confidence.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Kirk. Mr. Chiu. Next, I have Mr. Baines for 5 minutes. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll be sharing some of my time with Mr. Fergus here. Mr. Stanton, I'm going to go back to you just on this topic of the registry. One of the criticisms of the foreign agent registries, and several countries have had them, is that, and you've mentioned, I think that, you know, there's the new tactic is the proxies have eclipsed traditional spies. So how do we address, like, so if foreign agents are using proxies to conduct their work,
right?
You know, how can we enforce the legislation, or how do you broadly put the net on these Canadian proxies?
Well, here's the thing. The Security of Information Act is where we're going to get that enforcement. We're going to get that there's an actual legislated regulator you could use. The registry, and I know there's a lot of people want the registry, and I think it has merits. But I don't think it should necessarily be the priority towards the legislation. People that are going to put their name on the registry are people that are representing some foreign agency, whether it's a Canadian diplomat overseas, whether it's business, whether it's whatever, ideally so they're not going to get a fine. There are clandestine actors. If you want to link them to the United Front Work Department, they are not going to be putting their name on a registry. There's no box to tick.
Exactly.
So a lot of the most damaging foreign interference activity is clandestine. So what it's really going to do, and I think a registry is good, is it's going to allow the government to have some control over lobbying and sort of kind of rein it in a little bit, where I would have to identify if I am representing a foreign country. But is it going to really blunt PRC foreign interference in our democratic institutions? In my opinion, it's not.
Thank you.
Two quick questions, and I know that I risk doing this, so I'm going to ask them both at the same time, and I hope that we can get the answers. They're very different questions. Mr. Juneau, Katsuya, everyone here has acknowledged that this issue has been going on for decades. When we formed government, we created NCCOP and CIRA, the Site Task Force, the election protocol and rapid response mechanism, and the list goes on. Why do you think that these kind of tools were not developed by previous governments, although we all recognize that this was a long-standing problem? The second question, which I would ask, is probably to Mr. Wilczynski again. You had mentioned the importance of having diversity as part of the security establishment. It seems that we are always running behind because we don't have direct connections into the communities, diaspora communities who are subject to intimidation and pressure. What can we be doing? And are you aware of your former colleagues who are now in place seeking to deal with that issue?
Very, very quickly, I think it's a problem of culture. For too long, and it was mentioned by my colleagues during their for too long, the Canadian governments have not developed the culture of security, have not developed the culture of warning the general population or warning elected officials of the temptations, of the danger that they will be facing. If you have access to power, you become a target. You are somebody who might be sort of approached and used intentionally or not intentionally, consciously or unconsciously. You will be used. Let's remember one thing. The Chinese wrote the book 2,000 years ago, The Art of War, read Sun Tzu. It's right there, the how to use influence. They know exactly, and they're really, 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 really good at it. They became even better. So we have to develop a new culture.
So very quickly on equity, diversity, and inclusion within the national security and intelligence community. I know just a few days ago, actually, colleagues from the Canadian Security Intelligence Service released their an equity, diversity, and inclusion plan. Before I retired from CSE, that was my main task, was to work both inside and with colleagues on development of a similar strategy. The objective was to make the institutions more welcoming of that diversity, so that people's experiences when they came in were positive, that not only were we able to recruit them, we were able to retain them. I think part of the strategy needs to be, again, more transparency to engage a broader range of Canadians so that they understand what our role and responsibilities are, that they know that they're welcome, and that when they come, that they will be productive and contribute to Canada's national security. So we have to be deliberate, and we have to be quite open in understanding their lived experiences as they join Canada's national security community.
Thank you, Mr. Wilczynski. I've got enough time for about 2 minutes for each round for Mr. Barrett, and I believe Ms. Martinez-Ferrada is on the list for the Liberals. Got about 2 minutes, Mr. Barrett. Go ahead.
Thanks, Chair. Again, thanks everyone for providing us with your experience and perspectives today. We've been pretty clear. We've been crystal clear that we think that having a public inquiry, an open and transparent mechanism, is the best way to remove this from the political sphere and provide openness to Canadians. I think there's definitely a place for the type of transparency, like in the examples I mentioned from the UK, when there's incidents that give rise to that. What would the benefit be of having an open, transparent, public inquiry on foreign interference in our elections? Mr. Juneau, Katsuya.
The only way the inquiry would be beneficial is if we make sure that it doesn't turn into a partisanship, low fight in a ring fight. If we are capable, just like my colleague Arthur has mentioned, that we are capable to bring more transparency, it will bring greater awareness, greater warning to the population, and demonstrate the sizable threat that we are currently facing, and eventually, hopefully, give the adjustment and the power to the intelligence community to be capable to be much more efficient and much more capable to warn on due time our leaders of all parties.
Okay. Goes quick. 2 minutes, Ms. Martinez-Ferrada. Go ahead, please. 2 minutes.
2 minutes. The interpreter regrets the sound is too poor.
Pour Monsieur Chiu. Dans un article paru le 20 mars dernier.
Attends, s'il vous plaît. On a.
1 moment, please. Mr. Barrett.
Audio quality is not sufficient for interpretation.
Yeah,
okay.
It's not an approved headset.
Oui, je pense qu'on a un problème avec.
We're having an issue with your headset because this is the second time that we were not able to hear you properly, but I believe that Mr. Fergus will be able to ask your question for you. Yes, thank you. And I would like to thank Ms. Ferrada for sending the question to me. In an article from March 20th, your colleague, Mark Johnson, stated, "I had never noticed any interference during my campaign, and nobody raised the issue with me, and nobody has raised anything since. I've understood that the election was neutral. My adversary won without issue. The larger debate might exaggerate the issue and mislead voters on the quality of our elections and create mistrust towards an ethnic group." Mr. Chiu, do you agree with your former Conservative colleague?
Got about a minute, Mr. Chiu. Go ahead.
I'll try my best to answer your question. The interpretation was not as its best, but I believe those who are on the ground with many of the witnesses can attest to the fact that there has been coordinated effort in 2021 election across the country using disinformation and also employing lies and complete false statements to attack certain political party and particularly certain candidates. I believe those are true. And unfortunately, the country doesn't seem to be of any interest in getting participation and involvement. Throughout the election, I was not involved with SITE. Nobody from CEIPP was contacting me, NCCOP or NCIRA. None of these organizations were investigating, actually, even to date, other than CSIS that I provided the information to. Nobody, no Canadian officials has approached me and talked to me about my experiences so far. So my experience has been that Canada is open for foreign interference, that we are not doing anything. We've been expressing a lot of concerns and worries, continued disinformation to be spread, not just from state actors, but also non-state actors. Like, for example, the fact that, many of the interest parties are from foreign countries, and maybe they're acting on behalf of themselves, not necessarily a foreign
Thank you, Mr. Chiu. Thank you, Mr. Fergus. I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today. I know it was an action-packed event. We had 6 witnesses, which is somewhat unusual, but we did have 2 hours. The committee is going to be on a break now for 2 weeks. So as chair, I really wanted to bring what I thought was an informative panel together, and you all accorded yourself very well today with the information that you provided, not just in your opening statements, but in responding to the questions as well. Thank you to all the members of the committee, and I want to say to our witnesses, thank you on behalf of the committee and on behalf of Canadians for being here. Analysts, clerks, technicians, thank you. The meeting is adjourned. Thank you so much.
This has been a Maverick Multimedia production.